Have you ever seen those crazy videos of megachurch pastors roll into these giant stadiums, lift their arms in prayer, and everybody in front of them falls backwards? They lie on the ground, convulsing, screaming out prayers, speaking in tongues. Women get out of their wheelchairs and walk for the first time, and all kinds of maladies are healed and things like that. Well, I don't know too much about that stuff, but I do know that I've had my Pentecostal and other Christian friends bring those things up to me and say, you know, Annie, you're a Catholic, you talk about all this big stuff that the Catholic Church is and does. Well, where are your miracles? You know, why doesn't this happen on Sunday in your church? And I hate that question. I hate that question so much because we have so many miracles as Catholics. We don't necessarily televise them as much, but I think in a big way, maybe it's not at the forefront of our conversation because what we believe happens at every Catholic Mass is the most beautiful and mystical and intense miracle that anybody could probably think of. And that miracle happens under the simple, unassuming forms of bread and wine. But beyond that, we don't always realize what we're doing. We don't always realize the gravity of the Holy Eucharist and the sacrament of the altar. But from time to time throughout history, God has taken his big holy hand and pointed down to the Mass and drawn our attention to it with a new Eucharistic miracle. So in this video today, we're going to talk a little bit about those. Hello everybody and welcome to Get Holy and Die Trying. My name is Annie and like I mentioned today we're going to be talking all about Eucharistic miracles. The way I'm going to break down this video is in two-ish parts. First, I want to talk about the first Eucharistic miracle that we have recorded from the church. Then I want to talk a little bit about my favorite, which I think is beautiful and interesting and totally cool. And then I want to talk about the most recent Vatican-affirmed Eucharistic miracle. And then for the second part, we're just going to round it all out with talking about kind of what these things do for our spirituality, what they mean to us as Christians, as Catholics, and what we can kind of do with this information. So let's talk a little bit about the first Eucharistic miracle. To do that, we're going to go all the way back to the 8th century to a little town which at the time was called Ansanum. Today it's called Lanciano, and it's a little bit southeast of Rome. So there, in what was Ansanum, there was a Basilian monk who was giving Mass, and he finished the Eucharistic prayers, the prayers of consecration, looked down at the bread and wine, and seen that it had taken a totally different shape and appearance. What was wine turned into 5 fat, misshapen globs of blood, and what was bread now looked like a hunk of human flesh. And so I was reading about this, and for me, these fantastic miracles that happened such a long time ago kind of fall into the category of what I call Catholic lore, which is cool and interesting, but I'm not really sure how true it is. And I was thinking that while I was researching for this video, and then I ran into something super interesting, which is that we know it happened because we still have the flesh. It's still there in Lanciano, and you can go and visit it, venerate the body and blood, and check it out. And actually, for hundreds of years, the church has been running scientific tests as science progresses on these samples to learn more about what actually happened here. So the most thorough and most recent set of tests was performed from 1970 to 1971 by a doctor who at the time was an atheist. And they found that not only was it real human flesh, but it was from a man with AB blood type. Remember that. But they also found that the flesh was from the upper left ventricle of the heart. It's kind of cool, right? And that really sets the tone for a lot of these mysteries and miracles moving forward. To look at my favorite Eucharistic miracle, which I mentioned earlier, we have to jump forward a couple hundred years to the 13th century in Portugal, in a little town called Santarém, which is still there today, just like Lanciano. And this one has a little bit more detail to it. So around the 13th century, there was a woman who lived in a very unhappy, unhealthy marriage. Her husband acted like he hated her. He was abusive and detached and unloving, and she did everything that she really thought she could to fix her marriage. at the end of her rope, she decided to go to the village witch, and the village witch told her that she would help her. She would cast a spell on her husband to make him kind and loving to her once again if this woman could bring back the witch a consecrated host from the Catholic Mass, from the little village church in town. So, feeling like she had no other option, this woman went to Mass, like she always did, and when she received communion, she managed to hide it, and she kept it in her veil, because at the time, women wore veils or headscarves to Mass. And coming out of the church, while it was hidden, somebody stopped her and asked her if she was okay, basically, because there was blood on her veil. The host had started to bleed, and she didn't even notice it. And realizing this, terrified, the woman turned around and ran home, wrapped the host in the veil, and shoved it at the bottom of a big wooden chest in her bedroom. So she spent the rest of the day totally overcome with guilt and somehow managed to sleep that night, even though there was a literal bleeding host in her sock drawer. And she and her husband woke up that night to visions of rays of light coming out of this wooden chest and heavenly angels kneeling on their bedroom floor in veneration of the host. So they did what any God-fearing, terrified people, I think, would do, and got on their knees beside the angels and prayed. I'm sure all the things that were going through her heart, you know, what she was praying for, forgiveness, healing, love, closeness, adoration, thankfulness for this incredible sacrament. And in the morning, they got the town's parish priest who came and retrieved the host. This miracle doesn't really stop there. There are hundreds of miracles and some really famous ones that happened later at this site involving this bleeding host. I'm going to link some resources and documents below in the description if anybody is curious about reading more about what happened at Santarem. And one of the interesting things I think about this miracle is that, you know, us moderns, in our experience, in our perceived wisdom, we think of witchcraft as being this like fairy tale thing. You know, I love occult movies, occult fiction, things like that. I know it's bad, whatever. But I don't really think of it as being at the forefront of things to worry about. But in actuality, that exists. You know, that's very real. And I really only need to go as far as Instagram or Twitter or my local bookstore to find that out. You know, I could hop on Amazon right now and find, you know, children's coloring books that are centered around the demonic. It's kind of freaky when you think about it. And when I think of myself, like what I would have to feel, what I would have to go through to go to a village witch, you know, that's really intense stuff. That's desperation. And I doubt this woman hadn't prayed for her husband. I doubt she hadn't prayed for her marriage. You know, I doubt she looked at Christ as, she didn't go to Christ first. But still, at the end of the day, even after the most drastic measure she could find, the solution was found in the Eucharist. That's awesome. What a beautiful example. And just quick, before I move on to the next one, I just want to note that, you know, people say all kinds of terrible things about the Catholic Church and, you know, our theology on the sacraments and whatnot. But when occultists, when Satanists go after religions, when they try to steal communion out of churches, they always go for the Catholics. You know, it's just a fact of life. I see articles on it from time to time. I'll link a couple in the description just in case anybody kind of doesn't know what I'm talking about. But why would anyone go after the church in that capacity if this wasn't real? You know, why would you want to steal a consecrated host if there was nothing special about it, if it was just bread? Which, you know, we're privileged enough to know that it's not. Now, the most recent approved Eucharistic miracle, approved by the Vatican, because, you know, there's a process before the Vatican starts saying, like, these things are okay for veneration. The most recently fully approved Eucharistic miracle happened about 12 years ago in Poland. In 2008, in I'm just going to put it here, Sokolska, I think? Sokolska? In Sokolska, Poland, a young priest was giving Mass, and he had noticed that a host fell on the floor. So when that happens, the priest can choose to do two things. He can either consume it, Or if he thinks that, you know, maybe it's dirty or somebody shouldn't consume it or it's been desecrated, he can put it in what's called a vasculum. A vasculum is a little, kind of like a little bowl of water, and in it the host will deteriorate because they're made of thin, wafery kind of materials, and then they'll dispose of the water in a holy and respectful way. The idea is it's all done naturally. So he puts this host in the vasculum and he leaves it for a couple days, and coming back thinking it would be destroyed, he found it only partially deteriorated, and in the center there was a little glob of blood. The first thought was that it was a blood clot, so they sent it away for testing, and what did they find? But it wasn't a blood clot, it was again a piece of flesh. A piece of flesh from a 30-ish-year-old man with the blood type of AB that came from the upper left ventricle of the heart. Now, what was particularly amazing about this Eucharistic miracle was that the flesh was alive. The cells were operating and functioning as if nothing was wrong. And it even showed that the testing they had done had even showed that this man had undergone some extreme duress, you know, or I think the word they used was torture, the way it was translated, which sounds a lot like the crucifixion to me. Anyway, now I believe they pull out this host for veneration from time to time there. You can go and see the piece of cloth that it was rested on, which still has the blood from the bleeding host on it. And yeah, it's just an incredible miracle. What sticks out to me about this, you know, about this, and I was reading, I found this great line by one of the researchers. I found this great line by one of the researchers, which was, "How could you bring me the living flesh of a dead man?" Whoa, crazy. So, like, oh my gosh, that sends chills through my body. And there's something too about knowing that the part of Christ that we receive in the Eucharist is his sacred heart. He gives the most intimate, most loving, most meaningful part of himself. And, you know, there's that old tradition of like First Fridays where you go to Mass on the first Fridays of the month, and there's a particular emphasis on the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And I think about that when I go to First Friday's Mass. And I think about how important it is, how important God must think it is that we think about his holy and sacred heart as we receive his literal heart. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And in 2008, oh my gosh, that's crazy. That's like just a little over 10 years ago. Phenomenal. Okay, so now that we've talked about just a handful of these Eucharistic miracles, you might be kind of where I was after I was reading about these things, which is thinking like, all right, these are incredible and rare and amazing and kind of morbid and a little bit disturbing, but what does this fantastic, miraculous occurrence mean to me? You know, how does this possibly fit into my day-to-day spiritual life? And I think that's a great question. I kind of mentioned, I think, in the introduction of this video that God takes his big holy hand and points down to the Mass through Eucharistic miracles. And I think that's the big takeaway. God does these things. He gives us these gifts on purpose for us to use to get to know him and love him better. And at the end of the day, that's what all this is about, right? Loving Jesus better, getting to know him, being closer to him. So I think that's what we can do. We can follow God's example and put our attention to the most holy sacrament of the altar. And how can we do that? I think first, easiest, most important is to go to confession and go to Mass. Worthily receive the sacraments. Do not receive the Eucharist outside of a state of grace. It's not good for you. The Bible says some crazy things about it. Don't do that. Go to confession first, go behind the screen. You'll feel better after it, and you'll be a better Christian, you'll be a better person after it. Wipe slate, start new, receive the Eucharist, be super holy. Fantastic. So that's the first way. The second way I'd say is to learn. You know, go to the Eucharistic saints, because there are Eucharistic saints whose entire path to sanctification was through the Blessed Sacrament, among other things, but with a particular emphasis on the Blessed Sacrament. My favorite Eucharistic saint is Saint Peter Julian Amard. He doesn't get nearly enough attention, but he wrote some really good easy to read kind of guides for Eucharistic adoration. And there's so much depth, but delivered in such a way that's so easy to read. I'll put some of his writing linked in the description. Another saint, well, who might be a saint, is Venerable Carlo Acutis. Now, he's really interesting. He died really recently in 2006 at the age of 15 from leukemia. As he suffered, he offered his sufferings for the sanctification of the church and forgiveness for the sins of the church, which is beautiful in its own way. But he spent his time by collecting visual evidence and the stories of Eucharistic miracles and spreading them all over social media. How amazing, how contemporary, how relevant is that, right? And now he's literally on the path to canonized sainthood. I think they just exhumed his body a couple of months ago. He's an awesome person to read about. I'll put his website in the description as well. I believe all of his work was collected and travels to churches in exhibits, and you can request it to come to your church. And then lastly, I would say the last way to get to know God better through the Eucharist, through Eucharistic miracles, is to go and spend time with him. Go and spend time with the flesh, body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ in adoration. You know, there are set adoration hours for most churches, usually be at least a couple hours a week, or after the First Friday's Mass if they have one. They might do a holy hour with music and confessions, if you're really lucky, but it doesn't need to be that. You don't even need to go to the church when there is exposition. You can just go and sit in front of the tabernacle, which the Eucharist is placed inside of throughout the day, and you can bring your prayer to God. You know, I think adoration is something that can be kind of tough for people to attend. I know for me, I make a pretty regular practice of going, but I still have days where I just can't focus. You know, I get super distracted, anything like that. I would say if you're worried, bring a rosary, bring a book, you know, do some prayers by rote, some recited prayers, read a little bit if you can't focus, and then just put whatever's on your heart on God. Come to him and make sure. I think the best tip for adoration is when you don't know what to pray about, this in general too, when you don't know what to pray about in adoration, tell God all the things you love about him. You know, maybe it's how he's playful, right? How things kind of fall into place in a funny way in your life. Maybe it's how he's ever self-giving. Maybe it's how he's deep but simple at the same time, or how he gives you incredible gifts, you know, his timing or his lack thereof. Things like that. Just come to God with what you love about him. Get to know him better through the way you already love him, because you're made to love him. All right. I feel so edified after filming this. I might actually go to adoration tonight if I'm feeling up for it. I don't know. But I'm so happy that I got to spend this time with you today. I'm so happy that you came and watched this video. Thank you for sticking around. And let me know what you think. You know, leave a comment or a like or a dislike if you didn't like it. Subscribe if you want. I'm going to try to make a video a week, but don't hold me to it. If you do want a little more Catholic content in your regular life, feel free to follow me on social media at NoSinGang on Twitter and Instagram. I think my Twitter is pretty great, if I do say so myself. And in the meantime, do not forget to get holy, because you will die trying. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Bye! For the life of me, I cannot understand why anyone isn't Catholic. I just don't get it. I don't get it.